The Russians have spent a lot of money and effort building a whole series of myths around their invincibility. It has proven successful not only in Russia itself, but throughout the world. So it can seem very difficult to imagine Russia losing the war it started in Ukraine and what the world would look like after this defeat. As they say, fake it till you make it. But Russia has never been invincible, and fortunately, it's not invincible now. To understand this, we need to break down the myth of Russian invincibility into its constituent parts and see what it consists of, what it's based on, and why it still works, or even better, see if there is anything in it besides lies, propaganda, and distortion of facts. As always, we try to find clear answers to complex questions. Is it true that Russia has never lost a war? What are Russia's greatest military defeats? And finally, if Ukraine has every chance of defeating Russia, what will that victory look like? What is behind the thesis, Russia is invincible? Comic book and science fiction fans know very well that a captivating story needs more than just a main character and his antagonist. A well-thought-out universe must also be created around them, in which everything will happen according to certain laws and logic. Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Dune, Marvel. Russia is creating its own universe through propaganda. At its core is the narrative that Russia has never lost a war. This is not true. But in the Russian universe, it doesn't matter. After all, the claim of invincibility does not require truth or facts. It is aimed at emotions. You just have to believe in it wholeheartedly and not ask questions. Those who reproduce and spread the narrative believe in it themselves, and so they only notice things that reinforce and complement this belief. Facts that contradict it or cast doubt on it are simply dismissed.
Россия на протяжении всей своей истории никогда ни на кого не нападала.
Россия никогда ни на кого не нападала.
Мы на Украину не нападали.
Мы ничего не начали с точки зрения военных действий, а пытаемся только закончить.
Why is this done? So that people both inside and outside Russia believe in this Russian universe, so that it can grow, strengthen, and develop further. The population of the Russian Federation, convinced of the power of their state, will have a reason to be proud and will focus less on routine issues such as poverty and lawlessness. Are fair elections and a high standard of living really that important if the whole world fears and respects you? It isn't supposed to be that people usually fear the strongest. The world, in turn, may no longer respect Russia, but it certainly fears it because it constantly hears about its power, eternity, greatness, and invincibility. It's not surprising that no one wants to test whether a direct confrontation with Russia would really have catastrophic consequences, as the Russians themselves claim. But it never comes to a direct confrontation. Russia is doing everything it can to demoralize its potential opponents and convince them that resistance is futile. In fact, further proof that this narrative works is that this is exactly what the West thought when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Ukraine was given weeks, and it was believed that Ukrainian resistance would only slightly delay the inevitable Russia's victory. Fortunately, Ukraine didn't have time to think about it and was forced to take immediate action. The subsequent developments have significantly shaken the fantastical universe of Russian invincibility, but they have not yet destroyed it completely. The narrative that Russia always wins consists of several parts, and all of them are manipulative. It's like saying that a coin has only one side and ignoring that there is another. Let's take a closer look at the other side of this coin. The following 4 points are highlighted in bold and shown as a coin with one side of the statement and the other crossed out. The Russian Federation is the largest country in the world. Russia does indeed have the largest area of any country in the world. If you look at a map of the world, it seems huge, and it seems obvious why Europe is not rushing to go to war with Russia. This perception is reinforced by the Mercator projection. This is a way of depicting the Earth's surface on flat maps. Territories located closer to the poles appear larger. This is why Russia's territory looks twice as large on maps as it actually is. Moreover, Russia is only the 9th most populous country in the world. It's behind China, India, the US, Brazil, as well as Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nigeria. Russia has the largest number of nuclear warheads in the world. In terms of quantity, this is true. However, it's impossible to objectively assess the quality and combat readiness of Russia's nuclear arsenal. These are remnants of Soviet nuclear weapons. The last tests took place in 1990, and the results of all inspections are kept secret. However, this does not, of course, dispel fears that Russia might still use its nuclear weapons. The Russian army ranks second in the world in terms of military strength. The military defeats of the Russians in Ukraine and their intentions to reach Kiev in 3 days in 2022 were not just hints, but direct statements about the falseness of the thesis about the Second Army in the world. Such rankings are usually based on publicly available data on the number of personnel, military equipment, nuclear warheads, etc. However, it's objectively difficult to assess the quality and combat readiness of military equipment, as well as nuclear weapons, which we have already mentioned. In 2022, Russia was forced to announce a mobilization, which means that there are also questions about personnel. First, there is corruption. Since the 1990s, corruption schemes have been exposed in the Russian army where dead souls existed on paper and the money allocated to them was embezzled. Secondly, there is the quality of personnel and the nature of the war with Ukraine, namely the need to stretch troops along a long front line. This is not at all the same as marching into Kiev in parade uniform. The USSR was the victorious power in World War II. No matter how much the Soviet Union and later Russia wanted to monopolize this victory, it was won by the anti-Hitler coalition. Moreover, it should be noted that the Soviet Russian Republic was only one of the republics of the USSR, albeit the largest. According to official data, the entire Soviet Union suffered the greatest losses in the war. This is hardly proof of the power of the army or the wisdom of the military leadership. How did the universe of Russian invincibility come about? So we now have an idea of what the fantastical universe of Russian invincibility consists of. But it did not appear overnight. It began to be carefully constructed during the Russian Empire and was finally cemented after the end of World War II. The great myth of invincibility consists of smaller, local myths surrounding wars or even individual battles in which Russia, of course, always won. At least, that is how the myth was created. The Northern War of 1700 to 1721, the capture of the Kazan and Astrakhan Khanates in the 16th century, the conquest of Siberia, the Battle of Poltava in 1709, the Battle of Neva in 1240, and the Battle on the Ice in 1242. All these are pieces of a large puzzle of complete Russian victory. All of them, of course, had their own context. In these victories, the enemies of the Muscovite Tsardom and the Russian Empire were not always equal or stronger opponents. In the Northern War and the War of 1812, Russia was indeed opposed by powerful European empires, Sweden and France. Of course, victories require heroes, so at various times certain commanders were mythologized. The names of Suvorov, Nakhimov, Ushikov, Dmitry Donskoy, Alexander Nevsky, and Peter the Great as a military leader, not just a state leader, were pushed into people's minds through fiction, history, church propaganda, and the dissemination of their images wherever possible. And at that time, there were no satellite images or satellite phones to fact-check the latest victory or great feat, so everything the so-called bosses said was true by default. The image of military leaders was modelled after the heroes of epic tales, and the audience perceived them as something equivalent, something like eternal Russian superheroes who come to the rescue in times of trouble. This, in turn, was supposed to demonstrate the continuity of Russia's heroic military history. Due to the fact that there were few victories or worthy feats, Suvorov's aphorisms were also used: hard in training, easy in battle. The bullet is stupid, the bayonet is brave, and anecdotes about Kutuzov. Special attention should be paid to the Russian-French War of 1812, which became the backbone of the Russian imperial narrative of wars and victories. In 1813, it was first called the Patriotic War. This term appears in the book by war participant Fyodor Glinka. The feats of Count Mihail Andreevich Miloradovich in the Patriotic War of 1812 almost immediately it became commonplace in official rhetoric, historiography, and culture. The war itself became shrouded in myth. Russians attribute Napoleon's goal of conquering Russia to him and call his attack treacherous. They ignore the broader context that the Napoleonic Wars began in 1803 and lasted until 1815. Thus, the War of 1812 is only an episode, not the beginning or the end. Russia also fails to mention that Napoleon sought to expand French territory and influence throughout Europe. The Russians present the sabotage work of the military and intelligence behind enemy lines as resistance by the common people, imposing a national character on the war. They loudly sing the praises of the victory at Borodino, a battle that ended more like a draw, and if you take into account the ratio of losses and the fact that the French army continued its advance, it looks more like a defeat for Russia. Once again, they mythologize the image of so-called war heroes. The more prominent ones, such as Kutuzov, who was a servant of the Tsar and a father to the soldiers, and others, ordinary participants and partisan leaders, such as Denis Davydiv and Vasilisa Kozhnya. Davydiv was actually a career military man who organized sabotage in the rear. He fought against the French and then wrote about his experiences in memoirs and poems. As for Vasilisa Kozhnya, she was supposedly the wife of a village elder, a simple Russian woman who defended her homeland from the French in 1812. But in reality, there is insufficient evidence that she was a real person or that she led a partisan detachment. Instead, the Russians made a film about her, named a street after her, and issued a stamp and a commemorative coin with her image. Another war that Soviet propaganda removed from the global context was the Great Patriotic War. It was isolated and separated from World War II. The War of 1812 was perceived as the apotheosis of the glory of Russian arms, and Russian propaganda already called World War I the Second Patriotic War, the Great Patriotic War, or even the Second Great Patriotic War. But the Russians were quick to label others. World War I was a disaster for the Russian Empire, which ceased to exist. This led to the start of national liberation and civil wars and the creation of new states. Soviet Russia signed a separate peace with Germany, Austria-Hungary, Turkey, and Bulgaria in 1918. This was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which, among other things, recognized the independence of the Ukrainian People's Republic. A few months later, the Entente won the First World War, but Russia was no longer among the victors. However, the beautiful name Great Patriotic War was saved for the next time. In 1941, it was applied to the Soviet-German War. Soviet propaganda, like imperial propaganda, appealed to the myth of the War of 1812, and it also took up myths about ancient commanders and heroes. The pantheon was replenished by Zhukov as a clone of the myth of Kutuzov, Stalin, and the nationwide partisan movement. So now the myth of Russia's invincibility rests on two pillars, two great victories in patriotic wars in 1812 and 1941 to 1945. The first was won by the Russian Empire and the second by the USSR. The Russian Federation has had no such victories. The victories over Napoleon and Hitler were won by international coalitions. Both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union were important, but not the only participants in these coalitions. And in the context of the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian war, it should be emphasized that both victories were won with the participation of Ukrainians. Human, economic, and geographical resources were decisive, and that is why Putin seeks to establish control over Ukraine. He wants to have this resource to strengthen his position, to put pressure on Europe and beyond. The Russian propaganda machine continues to actively reinforce this myth of Russian invincibility so that everyone will continue to believe it. This fantastical universe in which Russia always defeats everyone everywhere cannot exist without all the parades and regalia of May the 9th, which they constantly try to attract more foreigners to its rewritten history textbooks, films, fiction, monuments, memorials, and finally T-shirts, mugs, and fridge magnets with images of Stalin, St. George's ribbons, and the sacred dates of the Great Victory. From the outside, it all looks impressive, and if you rely on Russian sources, it even seems plausible. But dig a little deeper, and the house of cards of Russian invincibility collapses before your eyes. It turns out that they made up all of these stories themselves, and if that's the case, then there is less and less doubt that Russia can be defeated. Russia has never lost. We figured out how Russia builds lies about its invincibility and draws the world into them. Now let's talk about Russia's defeats. Let's go in chronological order. In the Crimean War, which lasted from 1853 to 1856, Russia sought to expand its influence in the Balkans and seize control of Moldova and Wallachia. In response, Great Britain and France sided with the Ottoman Empire to limit Russian expansion. The famous siege of Sevastopol lasted about a year. The Russians faced significant difficulties due to outdated military strategies and supply problems. Important battles at Alma and Inkerman ended in defeat for Russia. In 1856, the Treaty of Paris was signed. It limited Russia's military presence in the Black Sea. For Russia, this defeat was a painful loss of prestige. The Russo-Japanese War of 1905 also added to Russia's list of defeats. At the time, Japan looked on the map much like Ukraine does today. The population was also not in Japan's favor, with 141 million against 46 million, but the Russians were unable to make use of this advantage of 4.5 million soldiers against 850,000 at the start of the war. The Japanese acted faster and more cohesively and also outnumbered the Russians technically, and in 1905 Russia was shaken by a revolution. As a result, in the war with Japan, Russia lost 2 of its 3 fleets, half of Sakhalin Island, a lot of money, and its internal stability. The First World War is also not on the list of Russian victories. Russia entered it on the side of the Entente in 1914. Then, against the backdrop of defeats on the front, the February Revolution of 1917 took place. The Russian Empire fell. The next revolution, the October Revolution, brought the Bolsheviks to power. And in March 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, which effectively took it out of the war. This treaty provided for major territorial concessions to Germany. It also recognized the independence of Ukraine, Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states, and in November, the Entente, which Russia had betrayed, emerged victorious. Russia plunged into civil war, which in turn led to the creation of the USSR in 1922. After World War I, Ukraine fought for independence and proclaimed the Ukrainian People's Republic. Poland supported this aspiration, recognized the UPR, and renounced its intentions to expand its territory to the borders of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth of 1772. Soviet Russia sought to expand westward. In 1919, the Soviet-Polish War began. Soviet forces hoped for a quick victory, but in the summer of 1920, Polish troops launched a surprise counterattack near Warsaw, known as the Miracle on the Vistula. It radically changed the course of the war. After that, the Soviet advance was halted and Polish troops began a counterattack, pushing the enemy back into Belarus. Ukrainians also played a major role in the successes of the Polish offensive. The hopes of the Russian Bolsheviks for a world revolution were buried. The Russians, of course, eventually twisted everything in their own way, turning defeat into a multi-move strategy that ultimately ended with the signing of the Treaty of Riga. It was as if they had planned to destroy their First Cavalry Army in battles with the Poles and Ukrainians. Between 1918 and 1920, Soviet Russia also suffered defeat in wars with Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The Baltic states defended their independence. This was achieved in particular thanks to the collapse of the Russian Empire, the country's desire for autonomy, and military mobilization. It was also due to the diplomatic recognition of the Baltic countries by major powers such as the US and France. Offended Russia, or more precisely the USSR, came for them in 1940. This time, the Soviet occupation of the Baltic countries lasted until the collapse of the Soviet Union. The First Chechen War began in 1994. Russia sought to regain control over the Chechen Republic, which had declared independence in 1991. Chechen fighters, led by leaders such as Dzhokhar Dudayev and Aslan Maskadev, put up fierce resistance. Russian troops entered Grozny, the capital of Chechnya. The conflict led to numerous casualties and the destruction of homes, schools, and hospitals. The Russian army suffered heavy losses. The war dragged on for years. Attempts to resolve the conflict through political means were unsuccessful. After Chechen forces won significant victories in the Battle for Grozny in August 1996, the Kazavert Accords were signed. They halted hostilities and effectively recognized the independence of the Chechen Republic of Ishkeria. At that time, the Russians lost, and the authority of the Russian leadership and its much-touted military power were called into question. What invincibility and glory of Russian arms can we talk about if Russia had to give up Ishkeria, which is 1,000 times smaller and does not have even half of Russia's military capabilities? Of course, the Russians have not forgotten this humiliation. They prepared better for the Second Chechen War in 1999. Regular troops, special forces, and aviation took part in it. In addition, Putin diligently prepared the ground among the Russian population, portraying Chechens as terrorists preparing to destroy peaceful, innocent Russians. Are these arguments sufficient to refute the thesis of Russian invincibility? It seems that even one defeat in war is enough to discredit such messages, and as we can see, there have been many more defeats. Of course, for Russians, the only reality is the one that is convenient for them, in which they appear to be the strongest and most powerful. Stories about defeats are invented by their enemies because they are jealous and afraid. What could victory for Ukraine look like? But Ukraine is also slowly becoming Russia's defeat. From threats to reach Kiev in a few days, the Russians are maneuvering to bargain for 4 Ukrainian regions. And as fantastic as it may sound to many, sooner or later, Russia will have to face the reality of Ukraine's victory. But what exactly does this term mean? In 2022, the Ukrainian authorities most often spoke of restoring territorial integrity, i.e., Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. This is an important factor, but not the only one, and perhaps not even the main one. Victory for Ukraine is a whole complex of components. Thanks to them, after the war, Ukraine's position should be strengthened and improved, and the risk of renewed Russian aggression must be minimalized or eliminated altogether. Essentially, victory will mean that Ukraine will retain its sovereignty, i.e., the right and ability to independently determine its domestic and foreign policy. This is something that Russia has been striving to destroy completely or at least limit for years. That Ukraine will receive effective security guarantees. The most obvious solution is Ukraine's membership in NATO and protection by the nuclear umbrella of the US, Great Britain, and France. That Ukraine will preserve and be able to accelerate the process of European integration. That Ukraine will be strengthened economically, receive comprehensive support and assistance in reconstruction, as well as foreign investment. Another important component of victory is weakening Russia to such an extent that the Russian threat to Ukraine is neutralized. This must also be done through a comprehensive approach. For example, Russia will be weakened economically and, accordingly, militarily through sanctions. It will be economically isolated and pushed out of the energy market and other international markets. The latter is possible in parts thanks to the destruction of oil and gas infrastructure by Ukrainian weapons. In such difficult economic conditions, when no one wants to be dependent on Russian oil and gas anymore, Russia is unlikely to plan military interventions in other countries. Against this backdrop, the political crisis in Russia will deepen. There will likely be a change of regime to a less aggressive one. Moreover, it will definitely be democratic. It will simply be more focused on solving internal problems rather than on gathering land. This will deprive Russia of its unfounded ambitions to become a world power, a superpower that can do whatever it wants, regardless of international law and regulations. The collapse of Russia, or real federalization, may be accompanied by internal conflicts, including armed ones. Confrontation may occur over resources, as well as on ethnic or religious grounds. It is in the interests of not only Ukraine, but also the world that Russia, for one reason or another, ceases to be a threat to other states and interferes in their affairs. But what circumstances could push Russia to stop being a threat as quickly as possible? In short, the loss of money, weapons, human resources, and partners. Military losses in both equipment and manpower, a reduction in economic resources that can be directed towards the war, depriving Russia of the ability to use energy resources and other economic layers as weapons, the elimination of Russian agent networks in NATO countries and beyond, information, economic, and cybersecurity. All of these are nails driven into the coffin of Russian militarism. And in order to achieve all this, it's not only Ukraine that must be strong and demonstrate miracles of resilience and courage. The Ukrainian state must receive comprehensive support on this path: economic, diplomatic, and military. Economic support also means sanctions against Russia itself and against the so-called helpers of the Russians in circumventing these actions, an embargo on energy and other Russian exports, and the elimination of the shadow fleet. Russian energy resources must be replaced with alternatives, for example, liquefied gas from the US, transit of Turkmen and Azerbaijani gas to Europe via Turkey bypassing Russia. Russia must be cut off from all its economic and political ties. This primarily concerns China, but also India and other Russian partners and satellites. Accordingly, Ukrainian military capabilities must be strengthened both through the creation of its own weapons and through the acquisition of foreign weapons from partners. NATO must also strengthen itself by increasing defense spending and strengthening its defense capabilities. None of this sounds fantastic because Ukraine has already proven that these scenarios are possible. One of the most convincing arguments is that Ukraine has literally sunk the myth of Russia's invincible Black Sea Fleet. There's not even anything to parade on Russian Navy Day. Ukraine is also effectively working to destroy Russian oil and gas infrastructure, using drone strikes and sabotage against military and other critical targets on Russian territory. We have already explained in previous videos why Ukraine's victory is so important for global stability and what its defeat could lead to. Russia's victory would plunge the world into chaos and new wars, and if this can be avoided, how can we not take advantage of this opportunity? What does victory mean for Ukrainians? Of course, it is Ukrainians who most eagerly await and desire Ukraine's victory, and for each of them, it means something different, often personal. For some, it's an opportunity to return home from abroad, for others to forget what it is like to carry sleepy children to a shelter at night, for others to take off their military uniforms and reunite with their families to live a normal, peaceful life. We can only partially rely on the results of sociological surveys about what victory means to Ukrainians, as they are conducted using different methodologies. In some, the answer options are limited, while in others, the question of victory is mainly linked to the restoration of territorial integrity. But overall, all relevant studies for 2024 indicate that Ukrainians consider the expulsion of Russians from Ukrainian territory to be a victory, and that the majority of Ukrainians believe or want to believe in victory. Sociologists do not usually ask questions about other components of victory that we mentioned earlier. Most people say they are ready to endure the hardships of war and do not believe in the effectiveness of a freeze or negotiations. Of course, there are those who agree to the so-called territorial compromises or a freeze of the war along the front line, but such respondents are currently in the minority. When will the war end? Ukraine has proven its resilience and readiness to achieve victory, and the main question is no longer whether Russia will lose, but how exactly it will lose. But of course, many people want to rely on predictions, deadlines, and dates, as if to say, tell us how much longer we need to hold out, and we'll do it. Statements containing specific dates also add fuel to the fire, but these are just loud headlines that later have to be changed to less loud ones, or explanations of what was meant. For example, Donald Trump promised to end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours as soon as he took office as US president, but he himself very soon had to push this deadline back to the more abstract by the end of 2025. Ukrainian assessments do not give a single answer or a single date because victory will be possible when Russia's resources to wage this war are exhausted. This will require time and effort from both the Ukrainians and their partners. Political statements about the end of the war are sometimes intended to signal desired scenarios or to signal to other players that certain steps are being considered. For example, The International Monetary Fund forecast cites the fourth quarter of 2025 as a possible end date of the war. Head of the Ukrainian military intelligence, Kirill Budanov, notes that Russia considers the end of 2025, beginning of 2026, to be key for its victory in the war against Ukraine. President Vladimir Zelensky does not give specific dates for when the war might end, but like all Ukrainians, he wants it to happen as soon as possible, and he believes that this is possible. In general, predictions with dates are a dangerous tool. Many in Ukraine remember the 2 to 3 weeks that literally became a prayer at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. There are also periodic statements in the media that Russia is running out of missiles, that its losses are growing, or that its economy is collapsing. All of this is indeed happening gradually, but it does not work in such a way that one can calculate the day when the Russians will finally fall. During 3 years of full-scale war, many statements and predictions have been made about the end of the war in 2023 or 2024 which have not come true. Therefore, it is better not to cling to dates or similar promises because, unfortunately, there is still no magic word or wave of a magic wand that would end this war in an instant. If such a thing existed, Ukrainians would have already found it and used it. Nevertheless, no matter how much effort it takes, we know for sure that Russia is not invincible. It has already lost, which means it will lose again. Empires fall when they lose ground and when their aggression and ambitions exceed their capabilities, and the Russians are moving precisely towards this abyss from which they will be unable to escape. But of course, we would appreciate them doing it a little faster.